reached a point in Ephesians where we've been looking at Christians and alcohol, and today will be my final message on that topic. Now, there are very many views out there as to the Christian's response to alcohol. Some are very legalistic in their approach to this subject, and then others are accused of being legalistic when really it's not legalistic. But I will start this morning by saying that our position, as with any position that we must have as Christians, any position that we gain from the Bible must be one that is truly based on love. If we've developed a position that is based on law, then it is a wrong position. But rather, love is always, always, always the motivating factor for the Christian. Jesus was asked this question. He was asked, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets." So Jesus did not say, "I am replacing the law. The law is out and now there is no law." No, Jesus said all of the law and all of the prophets hinge on this, and the hinge point is love. Because God hasn't changed. He has simply placed the law in the Christian's heart. So all of the Christian life can be summarized as loving God, that's the first tablet of the law, and loving people, that is the second tablet of the law. But we must ask the question, how is it that we love God? Because Jesus said, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." But unlike legalism, where there is an outward obedience, but an internal rebellion to God, if we truly are followers of Christ, we keep those commandments because we are being led from the heart. You are a letter of Christ, Paul said to the Corinthians, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. So that's how we love God. But now, how do we love people? We proclaim Christ, Paul wrote in Colossians, admonishing every man and teaching every man with all wisdom, so that we may present every man complete in Christ. Those two things, loving God, loving people, at the forefront of the entire Christian life. And we have reached a point in our study in Ephesians chapter 5:18 where Paul says, "Do not get drunk with wine, for that is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit." And for the last 3 weeks, we've been unpacking this truth as it relates to the worship of God, as it relates to God's commandment against drunkenness, and as it relates to God's positive instruction toward having a sober mind. And if you missed any of those messages, we do have all 3 of them on our website. So I would encourage you to listen to those, because what I'm going to teach on this morning builds on each of those 3 messages. And if you don't have that as the foundation, there will be most likely some gaps in your thinking of what I'm going to give you this morning. If we are followers of Jesus, our lives will be spent, as Ephesians 5:10 says, trying to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. I love that phrase as almost a motto for the Christian life. Here I am, a follower of Christ, trying to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. It doesn't mean that we've achieved that. It means our entire life we are spending trying to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. And this morning is going to be no different. We're going to try to learn what is pleasing to the Lord in a specific area, and that area is the area of alcohol, how the Christian deals with alcohol. And so what I want to do this morning, I'm going to set before you a framework of several questions that you can ask yourself to help shed some light on what is indeed pleasing to the Lord. And we're going to apply these questions specifically to alcohol, but I would say you can take this same framework and you can apply it to any area of life. In fact, you ought to take this same framework and apply it to every area of Christian conduct. And I think you're going to find that as you do that, you will discover what is indeed pleasing to the Lord. Now, I don't say that this is a list that is entirely complete. You might be able to come up with another question to add to the list, or another 10 questions to add to the list. That's fine. But at least be asking the questions. At least be exploring what is it that pleases the Lord. So as Christians, if we are seeking to love God with all our hearts, and with all our souls, and with all our minds, and if we are seeking to love people, what is the correct course of action? Here are some questions to ask ourselves. So number one, and we've looked at this before, is it the same thing as what is in the Bible? That's a good starting point. That's just simply good exegesis of understanding a text. You have to close those gaps to understand what the Bible is actually talking about. Is it the same thing as is in the Bible? If I am going to use the biblical example as a model for my actions, is what I am considering actually the same thing that is described in the Bible? Is the alcoholic beverage today the same as it was in biblical times? And I'm not going to really spend much time on this one because that was half of last week's message, that exact topic. We learned last week, no, it's not the same thing. The word wine in the Bible uses the word oinos. It simply refers to anything that comes from the grape, fermented or unfermented. And the practice of the people was that they typically mixed it 3 parts water to 1 part wine. In fact, it was considered barbaric to drink it unmixed, akin to eating raw meat. And in some cases, the wine was even boiled down into a thick paste that they stored in vessels or wineskins and squeezed out of it, and then they would rehydrate it with water and drink it that way. It would be something kind of like grape jelly, the consistency of that. That was their wine that they actually used. Not all the time, but that was often the case. And in that boiling process, you know what happens to the alcohol? It would have all boiled out. But wine didn't refer to the alcoholic content. It simply referred to the fact that it came from the grapes. So the wine that was consumed in a Bible was nowhere near what we have today. In fact, it contained anywhere from no alcohol to a maximum of around 3% as they consumed it. This is a far cry from the extremely potent alcoholic drinks that people consume today. So you can't say it's the same thing. And yet, many believers who advocate drinking alcoholic beverages have one basic argument. And it goes something like this. People in the Bible drank wine, therefore I drink wine. Case settled. And they might have a point if what they're talking about is the same thing. But usually they're not talking about drinking grape juice, and they're not even talking about drinking 3% alcohol. They're talking about something entirely different altogether. So is it the same thing as in the Bible? The answer, no, it's not. It's not the same thing. Let's move to the next question. Number 2, is it necessary? Is this necessary? Well, in ancient times, the water supplies often contained bacteria that could make people sick. In fact, it does that now in some third world countries. I spent some time in Mexico where I think on the last day we had a festival, and I ate part of the food there, and I visited most of the bathrooms from Oklahoma to Nebraska on the way back. But in those days, the water supply had bacteria in it, and the people had found that if you mix anything that comes from the vine, grape juice, wine, whatever, with that water, it kills the bacteria. Now, of course, they didn't know that the bacteria is what was causing the sickness, but they understood that they stopped getting sick when they drank it. And now we know scientifically that it's because grapes contain tartaric and malic acid, which kill bacteria. It's not so much the alcohol as much as those acids that destroy the bacteria. And so this is why Paul, even in the Bible, wrote to Timothy, no longer drink water exclusively, but use a little wine for the sake of your stomach and your frequent ailments. They knew that it was medicine to kill bacteria so that you could live a healthier life. So in that day, it may have been necessary. Paul says to Timothy, it's necessary for you. Drink a little wine with your water. Well, today, at least in the United States, our public water supplies have to be tested on a regular basis. And now, I'm not saying that that makes it safe. We've got all kinds of other things in our water. But at least it's tested, and the bacteria is probably not going to cause you to get sick. They add chlorine to it and other chemicals to kill the bacteria. So is adding wine to your water necessary? Well, no, it's not necessary in today's age. Here's a third question to ask. Is it the best choice to avoid drunkenness? A couple of weeks ago, I spent a message talking about how God feels about drunkenness. It's always condemned. It always displeases God. It's always condemned in the Scripture. So if you want to please God by avoiding drunkenness, is drinking an alcoholic beverage the best choice? There's a verse in Proverbs. It's Proverbs chapter 23, and it gives the profile of a person who is drunk, and then it says in verse 31, do not look on the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly. Why not? Why not look upon it? Because you'll be tempted to drink it. You'll be tempted to, when you drink it to the point of drunkenness. So the proverb is establishing it's safe to not look upon it. And you need to remember that in that day, the proverb was written when the strongest wine that people consumed would have contained about 3% alcohol. Now, if you compare that to today's drinks, which contain anywhere from 2 up to 30 times the potency, if you want to avoid drunkenness, the best choice is not necessarily even to drink in moderation. The best choice is to not look at it. Don't drink at all. Now, wisdom says to steer clear from any temptation. I like the way that James puts this in his book. He says, each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. And when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. And he's basically saying there's a part of walking in wisdom that is to know your own propensity to sin. I mean, if you've been a Christian for any length of time, you know that there are some temptations that snag you and entangle you. And James says, don't go that route. So is drinking alcohol the best choice to avoid drunkenness? The answer, no. It's probably not the best choice. Here's another one. This is question number 4. Is it then the best choice to remain sober? These are the two opposite ends of the spectrum. Soberness is commanded, drunkenness is prohibited. So is it the best choice in order to remain sober? You might recall from last week that the Bible positively instructs Christians to be sober in their thinking, because sober thinking pleases God. There's a study that I read that showed that after drinking 3 bottles of beer, there is an average of 13% net memory loss. After drinking only small amounts of alcohol, trained typists were tested and their errors increased 40%. Only 1 ounce of alcohol, which is approximately 1.5 drinks, increases the time to make a decision by nearly 10%. It hinders muscle reaction by 17%, increases errors due to lack of attention by 35%, and 60% due to lack of muscular coordination. So I'm not sure with these results, after 1.5 drinks, if anyone could be considered being sober at least not from the biblical definition of being sober, which means to be uninfluenced by intoxicants, or to rather abstain from wine. So even with the relatively small amount of alcohol that was present in some of the wine during the time the Bible was written, there are some groups that abstain from wine altogether. Let me introduce you to some of these groups. This is a study you could do later on your own if you're interested. The first group is Leviticus chapter 10, because we'll step through these 4 groups pretty quickly. Leviticus chapter 10. Chapter 10, verse 1, it starts out by saying, "Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took their respective fire pans, and after putting fire in them, placed incense on it, and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them." Strange fire. Well, why would they do that? Something funky is going on in Leviticus chapter 10. And you can take a look later at chapter 8. It's an amazing chapter that tells the extreme measures they had to go through as the priest, as Aaron and his sons had to go through to consecrate themselves before the Lord, just in preparation to even make this offering. In fact, at the end of chapter 8, it even states that for 7 days and for 7 nights they were to remain at the doorway to the tent of meeting so that they would not die. That's how dedicated they had to be to this whole process. That's how consecrated they had to be before the Lord. So now here we are on day 8. Day 8, and they're bringing strange fire before the Lord. Look at what happened. Verse 2, "And fire came down from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord." Could they have forgotten the consecration that they just went through for the past 7 days? I don't know. What's going on? Look at verse 8. This is what it says. "Then the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, 'Do not drink wine or strong drink, neither you nor your sons with you, when you come into the tent of meeting, so that you will not die.'" That's God's first instruction after he struck them dead. I think they weren't sober. I think they weren't thinking clearly when they brought the strange fire in. And then God said this, it's a perpetual statute throughout your generations. And that means that the entire priesthood in the entire Old Testament, they were to abstain from any sort of wine when they ministered before the Lord. Why? Now, verse 10, here's the reason. "So as to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, between the unclean and the clean, and so as to teach the sons of Israel all the statutes which the Lord has spoken to them through Moses." So 2 reasons. One is there was to be a distinction between the priesthood and the laity. There was a distinction between holiness and the profane. There was a distinction between the clean and unclean. And that was simply a commandment that God gave to the entire priesthood. And it was also because the job required teaching all of God's statutes to Israel, and you couldn't do that if you weren't thinking clearly. So the entire priesthood, they were to abstain from wine. That's the first group. Well, there's a second group of people. This is found in Proverbs 31. And we've looked at this passage a bit in the past. I'm going to read the first part of this chapter to you once again. Here's what it says, beginning in verse 1. "The words of King Lemuel, the oracle which his mother taught him." And this is how she is exhorting her son. She says, "What, O my son? And what, O son of my womb? And what, O son of my vows?" Here's an idea for you mothers or maybe grandmothers. If you want your children to listen to you, why don't you call them, "Listen to me now, O son of my womb. I am your mother. I have the right to tell you this because I bore you." Right? That's what she's saying. Listen to my words. Here's what her instruction is. Here's what she is pleading with her son. Verse 3, "Do not give your strength to women or your ways to that which destroys kings." What is the way that destroys kings that his mother would be so concerned about. This is what it says in verse 4. It is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, or for rulers to desire strong drink. So you're not supposed to drink it. You're not even supposed to desire it. It's not for a king. Why not? Here it is, verse 5. For they will drink and forget what is decreed and pervert the rights of all the afflicted. You see, the job is too important. Verse 8 gives the positive instruction of what he is supposed to do instead. Verse 8, open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all the unfortunate. Open your mouth, judge righteously, and defend the rights of the afflicted and needy. And here's the implication. You can't do that, or at least you can't do it properly when you're under the influence. Now, anyone who's in a position of importance needs to steer clear of the poison. I wish this was a requirement for our political leaders in America. I think we would have a lot better laws. I think we would have a lot better rights for people. I think that they would judge more properly if they were clear thinking. It would be disastrous for our nation if our nation were attacked by a foreign enemy and they call in the president and he's not sober. That would be disastrous. So priests you need to pass, civil authorities, you need to steer clear. Here's a third group that abstained. These are the people that are introduced in Numbers chapter 6. And the chapter starts by saying this, once again, verse 1, Numbers chapter 6, verse 1. Again, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when a man or woman makes a special vow, the vow of a Nazirite, to dedicate himself to the Lord, he shall abstain from wine and strong drink. He shall drink no vinegar, whether made from wine or strong drink, nor shall he drink any grape juice, nor eat fresh or dried grapes. All the days of his separation he shall not eat anything that is produced from the grapevine, from the seeds even to the skin. Wow. This is the highest level of dedication that a person could make before the Lord, and it involved first in abstaining from anything alcohol, even from raisins, from the seeds, from the skins. And the idea is steer clear of anything that even has the possibility of having alcohol in it. In that time, they used to take the skins and they used to take the seeds and they used to press those and ferment it, and they used to even get an alcoholic drink out of that. Well, there were 3 men in the Bible who were Nazirites for life, Samson, Samuel, and John the Baptist, and there were others as well. But in the latter days of Israel, as Israel turned more away from God, as their hearts began to get harder, fewer and fewer people were interested in consecrating themselves wholly before the Lord. And so by the time you reach the prophet Amos, this is in Amos chapter 2, verse 11, let me read you a verse from there. God indicts Israel with these words. He says this, then I raised up some of your sons to be prophets, and some of your young men to be Nazirites. That's the word there. It means to be consecrated, to be set apart before the Lord. God's saying, I raised up some of your children as prophets and some of them as Nazirites. Is this not so, O sons of Israel, declares the Lord? And then in verse 12 he said, but you made the Nazirites drink wine. Israel, God's people, made the set-apart people who are consecrated to the Lord holy, taking the Nazirite vow not to drink wine. Israel enticed them to drink wine. And they did the same with the prophets. And you commanded the prophets, saying, you shall not prophesy. So the very people that God had set apart for holy purposes to lead Israel, Israel enticed to go against their vow to God, and polluted them by enticing them to drink wine and break their vow. And there's another group of people in the Bible. In fact, this is actually one of my favorite groups in the whole Bible due to their faithfulness. It's called the Rechabites. These were a nomadic people, that were known for their strict abstinence to wine, from building houses, from sowing seed, and from planting vineyards. And these were simply because their patriarch, Jonadab, had prescribed it. You can read about them in many of the books of the Bible, but Jeremiah 35 probably has the most information. At the time that Jeremiah 35 is written, they had been faithful to their patriarch's instruction for over 200 years. So generation after generation after generation, faithful to the patriarch. And God says to Jeremiah, I'm going to have you set up a little test for them. And so Jeremiah did. And God instructs Jeremiah, this is Jeremiah 35, verse 2. He says, go to the house of the Rechabites and speak to them and bring them into the house of the Lord, into one of the chambers, and give them wine to drink. You see the dilemma? 200 years of faithfulness, and he's telling the prophet, I want you to bring them in, and I want to set before them bowls of wine. So Jeremiah did this, and Jeremiah tells them to drink the wine, and this is how they responded. We will not drink wine, for Jonadab, the son of Rechab, our father, commanded us, saying, you shall not drink wine, you or your sons, forever. And what's important to note in this is God's response. God responds by using that faithful family as an object lesson to all of Israel. And because of that, he promises destruction on Israel because they would not obey him. And he uses the Rechabites as the positive example of those who are faithful to a father. And then he makes this promise to the Rechabites. He says, Jonadab, the son of Rechab, shall not lack a man to stand before me always. That's a pretty amazing promise that God is giving to Jonadab and his line, that he will always have a man standing before God in the presence of God. Amazing account. So there's the four groups of people in the Bible who abstain from wine: the priesthood, the rulers, the Nazarites, and the Rechabites. And there is a fifth group. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this one. This is one you might be a little bit more familiar with. It's the elders in the church. There's two passages, 1 Timothy 3:3 and Titus 1:7. Both of those have lists of qualifications for the office, and it says that a man who wishes to be elder must not be paroinos, which means given to wine. Or literally, if you break the word down, the per means alongside, and the oinos means wine. He must not be alongside wine. He needs to be clearly thinking at all times. And so let me just simply make a promise to you as a shepherd of a church. You will never call on me needing something, needing counsel, needing prayer, anytime, day or night, and find me hindered because I've been drinking. That's simply a promise of the office to the people that are a part of the church. Why? Because it's too important. It is too important. My commitment to you is to be sober-minded. And so if you put the biblical pattern of leadership together in the Bible, those who are priests, those who are responsible for representing the people before God, those who represent God before the people, those who are the leaders, those who make decisions for the people, those who are the arbitrators, those who are the kings or the civil authorities, those who were to stand up for the rights of the afflicted, those who were the mediators, those who were the teachers of God's word, those who wanted to consecrate themselves before the Lord at the highest level of consecration, those people were to abstain from alcohol. And I think just from the fact in the New Testament, 1 Peter 2:9 calls us as believers a royal priesthood. Those two words together implying kingship and priest, I think that those two words together should mean that we ought to meet both the standards of priests and kings by thinking clearly, free from intoxicants. You see, when Jesus takes the old covenant and he abrogates it with the new covenant, He never lowers the bar. Go read Matthew 5. Go read Matthew 6. Go read Matthew 7. He always raises the bar. He didn't lower the standard. And he didn't lower the standard because what he did is he wrote the law on hearts rather than just outwardly obeying because it was written on a stone. No, in the new covenant, God takes the law and he writes it on a heart and he enforces it with love. So number 4, is drinking alcohol the best choice if the goal is to remain sober? I'd say no, it's probably not the best choice. Here's something to think about. Number 5, can it be habit forming? Is drinking alcohol habit forming? Well, of course it is. We all know that. In fact, statistically, 1 out of 10 moderate drinkers becomes addicted. That's just simply the statistics. And with the potency of today's alcoholic drinks and with virtually unlimited availability, you can go to any gas station almost and pick it up, any store that sells groceries. The habit-forming potential is actually downright dangerous. There's a verse in 1 Corinthians 6:12 that says, "All things are lawful for me, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be mastered by anything." It's speaking to the fact that some things have a tendency to master us. And the best way is to simply avoid those things. Don't get started on the path. And I think you get that. So is it the same thing as in the Bible? No. Is it necessary? No. Is it the best choice to avoid drunkenness? No. Is it the best choice if you want to remain sober? No. Can it be habit forming? Yes. Here's number 6. Is it potentially destructive? And I would once again in this area say yes. In fact, I would say it's potentially destructive in about every area of life. I mean, you name an area of life and it is potentially destructive. Physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, financially, relationally, by losing your inhibitions. It's destructive to your own body. One writer put it this way: regularly drinking alcohol is suicide on the installment plan. Because you drink enough and you drink long enough and you're probably going to die from it. It's just the reality of it. I know of marriages that have been torn apart by alcohol. I know people whose purity has been lost because in some way, shape, or form, alcohol has influenced decisions that they would not have made if they were thinking soberly. I know relationships that have been damaged because hurtful things have been said when people were under the influence of alcohol. I know people that have wrecked vehicles, wrapped them around REA poles because they drove off the road when under the influence of alcohol. I hear of people who lose lives because a drunk driver hits them. I know people who have lost fortunes due to drinking alcohol. I read last week about a homeless man who was holding up a sign, as they often do. He was asking for money, and the sign that he was holding read, "I'll be honest, it's for beer." And I suppose that he probably would have gotten people to give him money just for the fact that he was honest. But, the reality is, people, is that sometimes it's the result of being homeless, but sometimes it's the cause of being homeless. And the list goes on and on. I don't even think I need to say anything more on the point. It goes without saying that alcohol is potentially destructive. Here's number 7. And this is really where I want to preface it with this statement. This is where thinking must change. Because so far, we have been evaluating personally to myself, will this thing be destructive? Will this thing affect my thinking? Will it affect my drunkenness? Will it affect my sobriety? This is where the tune changes. And we need to stop thinking about ourselves. And we need to start thinking about other people. Here's the question, number 7. Is it offensive to other Christians? I would say yes, it is. I'm not saying to every Christian, but it doesn't have to be offensive to every Christian. Is it offensive to other Christians, some other Christians? And clearly the answer is yes. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this. I would say first that it's because for many Christians, they have been saved from a lifestyle of drunkenness. They understand the dangers of alcohol. And so when they see someone that is liberated to drink freely in front of people because they too have been experiencing the salvation of Jesus, it becomes very offensive to them. Another reason would be that maybe some Christians are trying to live a life set apart for God's glory. And they see that alcohol is a way that tarnishes God's reputation. And yet, sadly, in today's culture, there's a sort of a flaunting of a freedom among Christians today that I believe is very disturbing because it's not taking to heart the question, is it offensive to other Christians? Now, I don't have time to get into it today, but there are 3 chapters in the book of 1 Corinthians, chapters 8, 9, and 10, that if you have questions about what that looks like, go through and read those 3 chapters. They talk about how Christians who truly love people sacrifice personal freedoms for the sake of not offending others. As simply a biblical principle, Christians sacrifice personal freedoms for the sake of not offending others. There's a key verse, it's 1 Corinthians 8:13, and this is what it says. Paul writes, "Therefore, if food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause my brother to stumble." What's his motivation? Himself? No. It's another person. Another person, his brother. So why would you respond that way? Because you love a brother. Love, 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 love. Love is always at the heart. And in fact, love is the only valid reason for doing that. You can come up with other reasons not to do it. I would say those are not valid reasons. But if love is the reason, that is the valid reason. Here's number 8. How will it affect my testimony? And it's kind of tied to this number 7 that I just gave you, but there's other nuances to it. How will it affect my testimony? Here's the question I want you to ask. Are you happy to set aside any freedom for the sake of a clear, clean Christian testimony? Our testimony is often the testimony that we portray to people who aren't believers. 1 Peter 2:11, the apostle writes, "Beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts, which wage war against the soul. Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles," that's another way to say the unsaved, "so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation." A lot of people in the church might be saying this, well, I really don't have anyone looking up to me, so whether I drink alcohol or not, I'm really not going to influence anybody, so what's it matter? And if that truly is your response, here's my question. Why are you involved in no one's life as a Christian? As believers, we are called to be salt and light. That means we are to be the influencers of the society. So thinking that just because we're not in an area of influence in someone's life is not an excuse to drink. In fact, it ought to be a wake-up call to get busy doing what you're called to do as a Christian. And there's another group of people that might say, okay, I recognize that some might be looking up to me, and so when I go out in public, that's when I'm not going to do it. But I'd remind you of this key verse that we just read, 1 Corinthians 8:13. It says, "Therefore, if food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again." Paul didn't say, If food causes my brother to stumble, then I'll just go and I'll eat meat in private. And he won't ever see me do it. No, that's not how Paul worded that. In other words, Paul is saying, if you act one way on the outside, and you truly live a different way on the inside, textbook definition of that is that it's being hypocritical. In fact, Webster's first definition in the 1828 dictionary of a hypocrite is one who feigns to be what he is not, presenting an outer appearance to the public that is not consistent in the home. There's a passage in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 8, just a few verses earlier from the verse we're looking at today. This is what it says. For you were formerly darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness and righteousness and truth. And here's our verse, trying to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. And then verse 11, do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but instead even expose them. For it is disgraceful even to speak of the things which are done by them in secret. But all things become visible when they are exposed by the light. For everything that becomes visible is light. Do you get a hint from those verses that Paul is saying have a life that's hidden and have a light that's public? No. In fact, it's the opposite of that. It's that rather Christians are charged to expose the deeds of darkness. It's disgraceful to speak about the things which are done in secret. And it only makes sense. That's why they're done in secret. They don't want anybody else to know that they're doing those deeds. And yet the truth of God exposes those deeds. I don't believe ever living a double life is pleasing to God. Jesus said, you are the light of a world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Well, why wouldn't you put it under a basket? Because the whole purpose is that it would give light to the house. Now, as a follower of Christ, here's what I would ask. What is your purpose on the earth? What is your purpose? This is what it says in verse 16. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Jesus is not allocating living a secret life. He is advocating living a public life. And this is just consistent with the Apostle Paul as well. I think he says it best, really, in Philippians 4:9. This is what he says. The things you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things. And he already wrote the same thing in Philippians 3:17. He said, brethren, join in following my example and observe those who walk according to the pattern you have in us. He wrote the same thing to the church at Corinth, 1 Corinthians 4:16. I exhort you, be imitators of me. And again, chapter 11, verse 1, be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ. And to the church at Philippi, he wrote the same thing, Philippians 3:17. Brethren, join in following my example and observe those who walk according to the pattern you have in us. So over and over and over again, his point is simply this. As your leader, as a teacher, my life is on display. And in fact, I'm even exhorting you, do the same things that I do. I think that there would be any single person that could have looked at Paul's life in doing anything that he was doing, and Paul would have been okay with that. Not to say that he wasn't without sin, but I think he was transparent before the people. I don't think the people would have been led astray. Now, the Apostle John even says the same thing. Consider 1 John 2:10. And this is where it gets back to love. It says, the one who loves his brother abides in the light, and there is no cause for stumbling in him. He abides in the light. That means he's first of all doing righteous things, but it means his deeds are exposed. He abides in the light. There is no cause for stumbling in him. His actions are done in the light. They're not hidden. So why would you do that? Why would you expose your life to other people? Here's the deal. It's love. It's love for a brother. It's love for someone else. It's desiring that they too would grow up and become mature and saying, here, follow me. I hope that's what we do with our kids. I hope it's what even husbands are doing with your wives as her head saying, follow Christ as I follow him. Love, love, love. Love is always the motivation. Let me ask this question. What is the purpose of your testimony anyway? Is it that people might recognize you and praise you? No, it's not. It's not. It's not about you. Your testimony, I would say, is twofold. One, this is first and foremost, that God would receive glory because of your testimony. That God would be glorified. And then number two, that people might be drawn to know God because of how you interact with your God. So Christian freedom is never something to flaunt. Rather, it's something to be given up to help bring others to salvation. Here's some verses in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And once again, I said 8 and 10 are good chapters. You could read those as well. This is what Paul writes. He said, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I might win more." Let me ask you that question. Have you made yourself a slave to all so that you might win some to Christ? I hope so. I hope you have made yourself a slave to Christ so that you might influence them for the gospel. This is what he said in verse 20 of that same chapter. "To the Jews I became a Jew, so that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law, so that I might win those who are under the law. And to those who are without the law, as without the law, though not being without the law, but under the law of Christ, so that I might win those who are without the law." That's Jews, that's Gentiles. Paul gave up personal freedoms so as not to offend either group in order to be a testimony to the gospel. That's always the main thing. This is what he continued on. Verse 21, "To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that I may by all means save some. I do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it." So I'd ask again, are you committed enough to Christ to willingly sacrifice personal freedoms in order to win people to Christ? Are you willing to sacrifice personal freedoms in order to help weaker Christians grow in maturity and to walk in holiness? Because the Christian walk starts with self-denial. It's not about self-gratification. Jesus said, "If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself." That's self-denial. If you are in it because you want to have all of your needs met, then you followed the wrong leader. Following Jesus is a life of self-denial, willingly. Here's number 9. We're getting close to the end here. Number 9. This is simply this. Is it the wide path or is it the narrow path? Is it the wide path or is it the narrow path? In our previous studies in Ephesians, we've seen that there is a walk of the wicked and there is a walk of the wise. The walk of the wicked is the wide path. The walk of the wise is the narrow path. And the walk of the wicked is the wide path because, by default, that is the path that people are on. The walk of the wise is the narrow path because it is only found through Jesus Christ. So if the path that you are on is the wide path, and it looks the same way that the walk of the world walks, it might be the path of the wide. It might be the path of the wicked. This is what he said in verse 22 of chapter 4. He said that in reference to your former manner of life, you lay aside the old self, which is being corrupted in accordance with the lusts of deceit. It's basic to understanding what it means to be a Christian, is that when we come to Christ, our old ways are laid aside. Christ changes a life. The things that we used to do before in the flesh, we no longer do. And how do you get there? It's by following the Spirit. That's verse 23 of that same chapter. By renewing your mind. It's a self-examination. It's an examination by the Spirit. And it causes us to respond to the Spirit so that we are made in the likeness of God, in true righteousness and holiness and truth. Well, people that don't know God don't walk like that. So if the Christian is dealing with alcohol in the same way that the world deals with it, I would say you're probably on the wide path. It's probably still walking in the flesh. And here's the last one. And it's really kind of a summary of everything that we said so far. Each of these things that I have said will probably stand on its own. In other words, you could take your answer to one of these questions, and it's probably sufficient for you to determine a right path to walk on. Number 10 here is this, am I absolutely certain that the action that I'm taking is right? Absolutely certain. Is there any uncertainty? If there's any uncertainty, reconsider. We might phrase it this way. In other words, will God be disappointed if I don't do this? Will God be disappointed if I don't consume alcoholic beverages as a Christian? This is what the Scripture says in regards to disputable things. This is Romans 14:6. It says this, every person must be fully convinced in his own mind. Now, that's not to say that however you're convinced makes it right or wrong, but he's saying have a clean conscience before the Lord. The fact that you don't think it's wrong or the fact that you do think it's wrong doesn't necessarily make it wrong. And the fact that you think it's right or not doesn't make it right. Because there is a right and there is a wrong, and that's defined by God. But you must have a clean conscience in the way that you walk before the Lord. And that's what verse 12 says. So then each one of us will give an account of himself to God. That's the reality. You know, as a pastor, I will answer for the way in which I have taught and instructed you. And I will also give an accounting for my own life, my own personal life. But you will give an accounting for the way that you respond. You know, as a husband, I too will give an accounting for my wife. Go back and look in Genesis to see if Adam got called on the carpet for Eve's action. He did. You will give an accounting for your wife. As parents, you will give an accounting for your children. But each one of us will give an accounting of himself to God. So ultimately, the individual person is responsible for their own actions. So I'd ask you this, take these questions to heart. Think through them. Work through them. If you have questions, ask me about it. But I hope that you will land on a position where you have a completely clear conscience before the Lord, and you will respond in an action that is for His glory and for the love of people. Well, let's pray. Lord, this morning, this is a big topic that we've looked at. And Lord, we understand that we must be thinking your thoughts after you because we are in a world that gives us all kinds of philosophies of alcohol, and many of them contradict your ways. God, help us to think clearly. Help us to think wisely. Help us to think accurately that we can know truth and then we can live it. Lord, we thank you that you have very clearly commanded that we not be drunk. Lord, we thank you that that is for our protection. Lord, we thank you that you have also instructed that we remain sober. So God, I pray that we as your people would always have sobriety of mind. Lord, I pray that we would be wise in making good decisions as to steer clear of hurtful habits that might be forming in our lives. But I pray that we would also not be involved in things that are potentially destructive. But I pray that we would love other Christians enough that we would not seek to be offensive to any of them. And Lord, I pray that our testimony would be pure and spotless before a world that desperately needs to know how good of a God you are. Lord, I pray that you would glorify yourself through us, through each of us in our personal testimony. And Lord, I pray that truly it would cause those that don't know you to seek after you because you have a better way. Lord, I pray that we would be your holy people set apart on the narrow path, and we would follow our true leader, Jesus Christ, as he leads us by his Spirit on that narrow path. Lord, convince us in our consciences the way in which you desire we would walk in obedience to you. I pray these things through your Spirit. Amen.